Hello from ZTN Studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Welcome to the Mint Special. Our discussion today, the World Bank's bailout to Zimbabwe and Parliament's oversight role. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpapers TV Network ZTN and our partners, the Southern Africa Parliamentary Support Trust, SAPST. Hello, I'm Andy Hodges. As COVID-19 reaches most countries in the world, the World Bank Group is making available an initial package of up to $12 billion in immediate support to assist countries coping with the health and economic impacts of the global outbreak. This financing is designed to help member countries take effective action to respond to and, where possible, lessen the tragic impacts posed by the COVID-19. The World Bank Group expects to deploy up to $160 billion over the next 15 months to help countries protect the poor and vulnerable, support businesses and bolster economic recovery. Zimbabwe is set to get up to $7 million from the World Bank to fight the COVID-19 pandemic, despite being arrears with a Washington-based lender. The bank will mobilize $5 million from its Global Financing Facility Trust Fund to support the nation's health response to the outbreak and redirect about $2 million from its ongoing Zimbabwe Idai Recovery Project to support affected communities. The World Bank further stated that its existing multi-donor Zimbabwe Reconstruction Fund Technical Assistance Program is now focused on supporting the government's emergency response efforts. Joining us on our show today to discuss World Bank's bailout to Zimbabwe, Parliament's oversight role, we are joined in the studio by Tafazwa Chikumbu, socio-economic analyst from the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, ZIMCOD. Honorable Willias Madzimure, Parliamentary Committee of Budget, Finance and Economic Development member and MP for Kambuzuma. And later on in the show, we'll be joined by Ngobani Shabangu, Head of Programs at Transparency International, Zimbabwe. Gentlemen, welcome to the Mint Special.
Thank you so much.
Now, if you have any comments or views on our show today, please contact us via our Facebook page, Zimpapers TV Network, or via our Twitter handle at ZTN News. All right then, gentlemen. Willias, so let's start from just exactly from the beginning. What exactly is the mandate and oversight role of the Parliamentary Budget and Finance Committee?
Thank you, Andy. As you are aware, the Constitution, it is the responsibility of Parliament of Zimbabwe, as far as Section 198 of the Constitution is concerned, to protect the Constitution. And Section 298 deals with the issue of finance prudence, how we look after our finances. So as the public, as the Budget and Finance Committee, the responsibility for any committee, for that matter, is to maintain fiscal stability and long-term economic health of a country. So our role, that is what we oversee as far as the Ministry of Finance is concerned. The committee examines the expenditure. You talk of the administration and policy of government departments as much as it relates to the issues of finance. All those, as far as the spending is concerned, the Ministry of Finance has a responsibility to make sure that it deals with the administrative part of the finances. And the committee itself is then to oversee how money is allocated and how money is used.
Now, you have mentioned different sections of the Constitution, Section 298, for example, and that's great on paper. It's there in the Constitution, and your committee does have that oversight role by law. However, do you think that your committee has carried out Parliament's oversight role effectively?
As far as the committee is concerned, I can say the committee has done its best. The issue now is, does the Ministry of Finance respond to the committee advice, to the committee queries, to the committee observations? It is one thing for the committee to point out issues that are very important, and if they are taken care of, then the economy will perform. And it is another thing for the Ministry of Finance to respond. As far as we are concerned as the committee, we have even managed to involve the people in the budget making process. So we have been able to do exactly what we are required to do, even though we still think that we can do better. And also the laws can be amended to make sure that whatever we recommend, if it makes sense and for the good governance of the country, then the Ministry of Finance should respond and take necessary measures.
So are you saying then that, that the two parties, you've got the parliamentary oversight role or parliament and you've got the executive, are you saying that the Ministry of Finance in particular is not fully carrying out that mandate to report back or to do the things that you're doing or to fix the things that you've recommended?
I can say yes, the ministry is not doing enough. Even in cases or situations of emergencies, it is too proper for the ministry to go out of its way to make sure that the most important stakeholders of this country, who are represented by Parliament, is consulted. The members of Parliament must be consulted, because at the end of the day, all what the ministry does affects the people that parliamentarians represent.
Okay. So first of all, look, the Zimbabwe Coalition on Death and Development, ZIMCOD, is a socio-economic justice coalition established to facilitate citizens' involvement in making public policy more pro-people and pro-poor. Furthermore, you work on social and economic justice issues. So in your opinion, has the Parliamentary Budget and Finance Committee to date been carrying out its mandate and oversight role effectively?
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. I think Honorable Madzimure has stated actually what the law says, and the good thing about the mandate of Parliament in general and also the mandate of the Portfolio Committee is actually enunciated in the Constitution itself, and specific to Section 141 of the Constitution, it talks about the involvement of Parliament in terms of its legislative role, and I think currently, the government, though it has taken too long, they are actually realigning Public Finance Management Act to the Constitution of 2013, and it is the responsibility of the committee to ensure that the provisions of the Public Finance Management Act, they relate well to the provisions of Chapter 17 of the Constitution with regard to the principles of public finance management, the oversight role of Parliament in terms of budget expenditure and allocation, and also in ensuring that the committee does consultations in relation to any budget-related matters. And this is something that Parliament has been doing. But of course, I wouldn't blame it to the committee itself, but probably to the size of our national purse, which does not allow the committee to fully consult citizens, especially when it comes to the number of bills that are passed in Parliament. I think recently the government adopted the national budget, and it is the responsibility of the committee and the whole Parliament to actually approve that particular budget in terms of all the appropriations to different government ministries and also the parastatals and other state-owned enterprises. So, yes, the committee is carrying out its mandate, but there are certain cases where they do not fully carry out their mandate, especially when the government passes statutory instruments, for example, without the approval of Parliament, especially in the case of the current scenario that we are in, COVID-19, where we have had a number of declarations in terms of how the government is to review the Finance Act, and also is going to review the Appropriation Act in terms of the new allocations in the wake of COVID-19. All those decisions have been made without the involvement of the committee.
Now we're going to cross over to Ngobani Shabangu, but before I do, I just want you gentlemen to think of one thing: 2013 Constitution. The question is, of course, why has the Public Finance Management Act not been amended all this time? 2013 is quite a long time away. Anyway, joining us now is Ngobani Shabangu, Head of Programs at Transparency International Zimbabwe. Ngobani, welcome to the Mint Special.
Thank you very much, Andy.
Now then, Ngobani, Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ, is a non-profit, non-partisan, system-orientated local chapter of the international movement against corruption. But I want to ask you this: do you think Parliament and its committees can better hold the executive or government to account in respect of its oversight role?
Yes. the Parliament can and should hold the executive to account. It has got it is its constitutional mandate and duty to do so, and we believe that the Parliament should rightly do its job. However, we need to also take into consideration also that other players can equally or can substantially play a role. For example, the civic society through advocacy processes that I'm sure they are already going on.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, your organization does look at corruption in particular. And there's a perception and belief that whenever any financing package is proposed or implemented, they are leakages. So how do you think that Parliament can effectively ensure such leakages do not occur? Because, of course, it's through leakages that possibly corruption rears its ugly head.
One of the things that when you raise the perceptions, we need to understand where these perceptions are emerging from which standpoint. There are issues to do with trust. There are issues to do with the historical background on how such similar finances have been handled by the government, and justifiably so. People have raised concerns of leakages, but how can now the Parliament ensure that such leakages do not occur? Basically is to let's follow the Constitution to the letter. Let's follow the rules that are existing to the letter to ensure that some of the leakages are not evidently seen. For example, I can give a case on how, especially in this current context, how the Parliament should sit and ensure that they play their oversight role. They put the government to task. They put the Ministry of Finance to task on how funds are being handled. They put the Ministry of Health to task as well on how they are utilizing the already existing funds. So we need a stronger Parliament that effectively asks the right questions and sufficiently plays its role as an oversight of the government.
Now, both you and my guests in studio have talked about the Constitution and what's in the Constitution that gives Parliament its teeth, or the laws that guide what it should do in terms of public finance management. But it appears that these don't, it's in paper, but it's not happening in practice. Do we have effective legal instruments in place to ensure Parliament's oversight role? And also, do we have legal instruments in place to ensure that we can bring perpetrators to book if they break these laws?
Legal instruments are there. I think the debate for the past 5 or so years in Zimbabwe has been that legal instruments, policies, they are there, they are effectively there. But the glaring gap has always been on how do we implement. We have institutions, for example, you asked about how can you put people to book? Yes, we can. We have ZAC, we've got other commissions that are mandated to investigate and play their role. So the evident gap over the years has been how the implementation aspect. So that is the glaring gap that we still cry about as a civil society, and I'm sure the public also equally emphasizes that point.
Now, you talk about these institutions like ZAC and so forth that can cut down on corruption. However, again, there's a perception that really is not happening, or is not happening as fast as citizens would like. What would be your comment to that?
One thing that we should understand, I think, that we should grasp with is that dealing with issues to do with corruption, for example, it's not a one-size-fits-all, or we can just quickly. It's not a low-hanging fruit approach. There are so many aspects that are involved. We need to build institutions that people can trust, and that takes time. We need to ensure that we resolve some of these institutions to be independent, to effectively carry out their investigation. So, understandably, people citizens, when they see corruption issues not taking time or not being effectively concluded, then they start to raise such issues, and then they also raise issues of trust. So we we have all these complexities when we're dealing with corruption, and we need a holistic approach, and we need all the stakeholders in the anti-corruption value chain in this particular case to effectively put all hands on deck and deal with corruption.
Now, Ngobani, I have asked this question before to numerous panelists, and I'd like to see if you can give me a sufficient answer. What is the best practice that the government should follow to get approval from Parliament with regards to budgeting and funding and transparency? And are we actually following those best practices?
Well, I assume that the question is in line with what is already happening, particularly in this context of COVID-19. Well, other states have actually ensured that the Parliament continues to sit in, either through committees, either through task force, but ideally the Parliament should continue to sit in and play its key role of legislative oversight and being representative. Equally, Zimbabwe should actually ensure that the Parliament sits in and start to account and start to ask the right questions to the government. And also sufficiently, in this particular case, we are talking about a supplementary budget and how things have been occurring for the past month or two. So we need to follow the proper procedures going forward.
In fact, that's exactly my question. I mean, when should Parliament or the committees in Parliament get involved in the discussion with government on matters of funding? Should they do it while it's happening? Should they only do it after the government has secured the funding and come to Parliament? Or what should they be doing?
They should be doing it as we are implementing, particularly right now. Remember, for example, when you talk about the funds that we've been receiving for the past month, that becomes like a supplementary budget. So we need to the Parliament needs to sit in earnest and ensure that it continues to monitor as we are implementing any efforts to try and fight COVID-19.
Ngobani Shabangu, Head of Programs at Transparency International Zimbabwe. Thank you very much for joining us on the Mint Special.
Thank you very much.
Well, you heard there what Ngobani had to say. Now, Williams, recently the government announced an 18 billion stimulus package. Let's call it a supplementary budget in effect. And of course, the World Bank has also agreed to give Zimbabwe $7 million to fight the COVID-19 pandemic, despite us being in arrears with them. So what exactly, again, following what I said to Ngobani, what exactly are the procedures that should be followed by the government with regards to these two financing packages? And in fact, any type of financing packages. Should they have consulted you first? Should they consult you first? What actually are the real specific procedures that should be followed?
Yeah, when we are faced with the pandemic that we have, which we all agree that is something that no one expected to happen, we have the presidential powers that can be used to make certain decisions. But as soon as that happens, the Minister of Finance should then come back to Parliament to report as to what will have happened. As you may be aware, we have got Section 303 of the Constitution, which deals with the role of accountability of institutions like Parliament in the mobilization and the allocation of resources towards COVID-19. Section 303 of the Constitution provides for that no any money can be withdrawn from the Consolidated Revenue Fund except to meet expenditure authorized by the Constitution. And when we say that, we mean what we have agreed as Parliament through the budget. So in this case, the government can make certain decisions to mitigate the problem that we have. But as soon as Parliament starts sitting, the Minister of Finance must come back and they report to Parliament. In this case, the funds that we are talking about, the 5 million and the 2 million. The 2 million had been already given to Zimbabwe to deal with the cyclone Idai effects. And the 5 million was already given to Zimbabwe for something else which it was supposed to be used on. But then the World Bank has now agreed that that money, the 5 million, can be used on to mitigate the effects, especially on the health sector, precisely to deal with the COVID pandemic. So as Parliament, our role is now to ensure that that money is used properly for the intended purposes.
I mean, that's exactly the point, isn't it, Tafazo and Willius? I mean, the fact is this, the World Bank has reallocated funds, 2 million, as you said, that was already given to Cyclone Idai, and of course 5 million reallocated as well towards particularly towards the health sector. It's about transparency, isn't it? Because World Bank is going to want to know where were these funds spent? Is the World Bank paying directly to the beneficiaries? This transparency aspect is critical. You know, it's implied that government needs to come back to Parliament first, I would assume, and then obviously then to the nation to explain what the money, where did they get the money from, how was it spent on, who was it given to, who are the suppliers. What would be your comments?
Okay, yeah, this is a discussion around the World Bank funding in particular, but what I just want to say is that it's a general practice, even before we look at the Constitution itself. It's a general practice that all the revenue collections, allocations and disbursements, they are not done by the executive without consulting Parliament. And in this particular funding, the government should exactly do the same. And I've talked about the roles of Parliament, which are defined in Section 119 of our Constitution in respect of their oversight role, their legislative role, and also their representative role. The fact that they are required to input into the executive decision is the fact that they represent the majority of citizens. And they can't subject that to all the citizens of Zimbabwe, but they do so through Parliament. And it is indeed the role of the executive to ensure that whatever decision they are making, not just with regard to public finance management, are subjected to transparency, accountability, and also public participation. We might not participate as individuals, but we can participate through our representatives in the National House of Assembly.
Willius, you mentioned that the World Bank has already given us the money, but they were reallocating. Agreed, right? So therefore, your committee obviously previously had approved that funding. Is that correct?
The committee had informed of the fund.
Had been informed of that fund prior.
The actual, can I say, what the minister was supposed to have done was to present that agreement to Parliament. Whenever, the Constitution provides for that, whenever the president or a minister who will be representing a president sends his or her signature on behalf of the government of Zimbabwe, that particular agreement must come to Parliament. For Parliament to authorize, to accept, it's like you present it to Parliament, you allow members of Parliament to make a contribution, and the Speaker will then say, are we of the opinion that we agree to this agreement? And the members of Parliament will say, that is when you hear the Speaker saying, those of that opinion will say aye, and the
or nay.
Exactly, or nay.
But it's a bit deeper than that, because it's like paying Peter to Paul, isn't it? I mean, if already the funding was $2 million, for example, to Cyclone Idai victims and to reconstruct that part of the country, that terrible calamity that we had.
Yes.
That means that they now don't have that $2 million that was originally budgeted for them to help them out, and it's been moved to, obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's a budget gap, so to speak, for what you as parliamentary committee approved.
Yes.
So what happens about that then? Because that has repercussions for people, other citizens in our country, particularly
what will then have to happen is that the government will eventually need money again to be allocated for that previous purpose, where the money will have been moved to another area. And what the law says now is that while the executive can, during an unforeseen problem like the one we have, make some certain decisions, but it also has limitations. It cannot spend more than 5% of the previously agreed budget, total budget.
On these unforeseen circumstances?
Yes, they cannot use more than 5%.
Okay.
Not only that, after all this has been said, the executive still has the responsibility to go and report it to Parliament in detail what will have happened. And the Parliament has the authority to even disagree with the executive.
Tafazo, I hear what Williams is saying, and he's right. You know, as he said, that's what the Constitution says, that's what the parliamentary rules say, and so forth. But it doesn't appear in practice that that's actually what's happening, does it?
Yeah, actually, you know, the Constitution and probably the Public Finance Management Act, it does provide also room for certain decisions to be made by the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Finance, and also in some circumstances like these, where even the President does make a decision, but then after making that particular decision, it will not take effect without the approval of Parliament. So in this particular instance, if Parliament was sitting, they were going to take the proposal to say, as government of Zimbabwe, we want to approach the World Bank and request for a reallocation of resources towards this particular emergence. And Parliament, being the representatives of the citizens, they would actually come through, debate that particular proposal on the basis of the pros and cons, like you said, that we are also prejudicing some citizens who are supposed to benefit the resource. But then look at the bigger picture to say, what if they look at the opportunity cost rather, to say, what is the opportunity cost of not funding COVID-19, which was not budgeted for? Because, and what you need to understand is that when the 2020 national budget was availed, we didn't have COVID-19 in the picture. So it means all resources were earmarked for other purposes. But then with the emergence of the disease, there was need for reallocation of resources. And I think if you have listened to the Minister of Finance, he said all expenditures, capital expenditures, they are going to be reallocated to COVID-19. It means they've looked at the possibility of foregoing certain infrastructure to save lives. And of course, such decisions were made by the ministry without consulting Parliament. And our expectation is that Parliament should always assume its oversight, and they should scrutinize all government decisions, irregardless of the circumstances that we are in. I'm sure if you follow conversations in South Africa, Parliament is also part of the special services in terms of responding to COVID. But in our case, Parliament went on recess at a point when we needed them most, and they also met to adjourn, and we don't even know when they are going to resume their sitting to discuss those important issues. So it is our hope that they do resume sitting now, so that we don't wait until the last minute, probably to wait for the Auditor General's report to come out, and then Parliament does its oversight role.
All right, so we're going to have to take a short breather. If you have any comments or views on our show today, please contact us via our Facebook page, Zim Papers TV Network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. You're watching the Mint Special. Our discussion today, the World Bank's bailout to Zimbabwe, Parliament's oversight role. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, the Southern Africa Parliamentary Support Trust, SAPST. Please join us after the breather. We'll be right back. Don't go away. Welcome back. This is the Men's Special. Our discussion today, the World Bank's bailout to Zimbabwe, Parliament's oversight role. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network ZTN and our partners, the Southern Africa Parliamentary Support Trust, SAPST. Tapazo, before the breather, you were talking about really this oversight role and transparency and so forth. But one perception as well is that, you know, I always look at this like a business. If you're a business, yes, and you're given a budget as a business, you can't, as an executive, just reallocate willy-nilly where you like to, and then go back to your board and say, we've done this, can you rubber stamp it? So the question is Parliament actually just rubber stamping the decisions that the executive has made and not really being fully involved in the debate about it? I'll also bring this to Williams as well.
Oh, okay. Like I said, that this does happen in unforeseen circumstances of this nature, in which a decision is made, but then the Constitution and the rules of Parliament, they do point out that within 8 days, when Parliament resumes its sitting, the Minister of Finance has to present all the appropriation decisions and finance decisions that have been made for parliamentary approval. And this is not the ideal situation that we would have wanted, but then the situation also does dictate what needs to be done by either the government also and also Parliament. And it also explains my concern for Parliament to go on a recess at a time when such emergent decisions were also being made. And I think there are various ways in which the government should have consulted Parliament, not particularly the whole lower and upper house in a sitting, but probably consult through the portfolio committee. And I think currently even the head of state has had meetings at the SADC level, at the AU level, through virtual means. And we expect that to start at home rather than actually embracing technology to speak to the outside world without having a conversation in country.
You heard my question to Tafadzwa. The perception that Parliament rubber stamps decisions the executive has already made, and of course he also brought up something very critical, that when you resume sitting, you should expect the Ministry of Finance to come to your committee within 8 days, or to Parliament, to seek approval from the committee. Can you comment on those two issues?
Yeah, thank you very much. Section 34 of the Public Finance Management Act authorizes the President by special warrant to authorize the issue from the Consolidated Revenue Fund in advance of the Appropriation Act of Parliament of such sums as may be required for the purpose of meeting expenditure which is unforeseen or has not been provided for in the budget. So, however, that total, as I have said, cannot exceed the 5%. And when Parliament sits next, then the Minister of Finance shall submit an appropriation for appropriation by the Act of Parliament, so that that money that was spent within the next 14 days, of which the House sits next after such expenditure has been authorized. So effectively, this is a mitigatory measure. But if we are to be an effective Parliament, if we are to be an effective democracy, Parliament must be consulted along the way. The Budget and Finance Portfolio Committee can easily sit, and this social distancing can easily be maintained. It is responsible for the most important stakeholder to understand what the executive is doing at any given time. That is exactly the reason why we will then ask questions. We can only ask questions if we understand what the executive is doing. So it's not asking for too much, but to ensure that there is accountability. Because it is also possible that during such pandemics, a lot of funds are misused. A lot of funds are misdirected. Right now, it is the responsibility of the ministry to consolidate all the donations that we receive. And the Parliament must know, because some of the donations are meant to benefit the people that we represent. And they ask us questions. What are you doing as members of parliament? We hear so much money was given for the elderly, so much money was given for the education, because this pandemic is also going to affect our children. We have got a lot of children who do not know what a cell phone is, who can go online to learn online. But this is exactly what is required for the government to do right now. So those are the issues that we must understand as members of parliament.
Yeah, but I mean, what you've just described in essence is that your committee is sitting after the government has already spent the money. So in other words, you are rubber stamping what the government's done, and you're not really getting involved in debate unless government follows what you've just said now, which is that constant discussion while it's happening. So by the time it gets to the committee, you know what you're talking about. Rather than you've already spent the money, let's approve it.
Yeah, dead right. You are dead right. We are rubber stamping. Why I said at the beginning of our discussion that we are doing the best what we can do. We have tried to push government to succumb to certain fundamentals that must be followed when even working on the budget. But also on the spending, the government must do so. And this is what is not happening. At the end of the day, I cannot dispute when people say, you parliamentarians, you are rubber stamping.
Because you are.
Because we are.
Okay, thank you. So, Fazwa, you know, the 18 billion stimulus package which was announced by the government of Zimbabwe, I suppose the million-dollar question is, do we have the money for it? Because it's not in the 2020 budget that the minister announced in November last year. So, do we have the money? Where can we get the money from? And also that links into the tax aspect, because as we said, 95, 96% of government's revenue is taxation. So we can't keep on taxing ourselves. So what would you say to that? Do we have the money? Where do we get it from?
Okay. Yeah. If you listen to the president's statement, he said that our supplementary budget, especially towards mitigating the impact of COVID-19, are within the regional thresholds, which is around 9% to 10% of GDP. And precisely our stimulus package is around 28% of the total budget for 2020. And he also stated that we are also getting donations from other countries, from individuals, from companies. But he went on to say that these resources will be generated internally, and we look at the capacity of the state to generate those resources, and particularly through taxation. What I would say is that as a country, we are in a catch-22 situation, in which, on one hand, we are imposing tax relief measures to the same companies, but at the same time, we also want to generate the same resources from the same companies. It's not a situation that we find ourselves now, but we also need to reflect on the pre-COVID-19 scenario, where we were not even able to generate enough resources to finance our own development. And COVID-19, of course, has actually worsened the situation. So it is really difficult for us. We are in a very precarious situation as a country in terms of mobilizing resources. Unlike South Africa, for instance, which clearly stated that our resources for stimulus package are going to come specifically from our internal sources and also from multilateral institutions. And in the case of Zimbabwe, we are not receiving any donor funding. We are not receiving any external funding in the form of loans from multilateral institutions, let alone bilateral institutions, especially those that are members of the Paris Club and also those that have shares within the IMF and the World Bank. They are not at liberty to give us funding simply because we still owe them money. And even if we don't owe them money, but they are part of that club which defines in terms of the rules that have to be followed by the creditors when they lend money to Zimbabwe. So in actual fact, the capacity is not there. If you look at the ZIMRA report for the first quarter, we managed to mobilize $13.4 billion within the quarter, January to March. And if you look at 18 billion, this is, I think we're supposed to generate those resources within a period of 4 months. And then that means
additional
resources. Additional resources. That means we generate those resources within 4 months. We don't allocate those resources to any other use besides funding the stimulus package, which is rather
it's impossible.
Not possible.
Well, yes, you know, it's interesting. As I said, your committee, Budget and Finance Committee, one aspect, and Tafazwa touched on this, is the issue of raising taxes. Now, Parliament is aware, you represent the people, you represent us. You're aware of the hardships that people are going through and the taxation that is already heavily on Zimbabwean citizens. Would you personally, or would your committee personally support any sort of supplementary budget that would increase taxes further on already hard-suffering Zimbabweans?
Yeah, well, we cannot afford to increase any taxes. After all, the manufacturing sector is one of those sectors hard hit by the COVID-19. And if we also look at the package that the government has, 34% goes to agriculture. But does it follow that agriculture employs most of our people in Zimbabwe? Again,
about 1.2 million, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, but out of 14 million people, we still have got other sectors that should have been prioritized that can also create a lot of employment. So in terms of the manufacturing sector, which must also contribute a lot in terms of taxes, they are in a dire strait. They can't, in a bad situation. We cannot expect a lot of money to come from those. So where does it leave the government to do? It's like, you know, we have to think of the long-term savings bonds of 2 to 5 years. That
goes to the market to raise the financing.
Exactly, to mop up the excess liquidity that we have. If you refer to the February 2020 monetary policy, where it was disclosed that about 50% of the $34.5 billion is concentrated on only about 200 entities. Yeah, so that could be another way of raising the funds.
It's a chicken and egg, isn't it?
It is.
Because you know that the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting all business across the board. It's affecting private citizens as well. On the other side, government does need to raise the money to deal with the pandemic, but obviously can't continue taxing business and citizens. So what is the question? They won't get loans either?
Yeah, so the other method that we can use is to try and restructure the 2020 national budget, where we will then say reprioritizing the capital expenditure.
For 18 billion, it's only a 60 billion plus budget. 18 billion of that, or let's just say 20 billion to round it up. That's a lot of money to reprioritize in a budget.
Exactly. This is, you know, the point is, as Zimbabwe, we are in a very, very difficult situation. What we only need to do is to do a lot that we should have been doing all along to make sure that we are in a proper standing. You know, we can approach other institutions for assistance. But the situation in which we are is very, very difficult. And when we also talk about the 18 million, you then say, sorry, 18 billion. What currency are we talking about here? What's the exchange rate? There's a lot of things.
There's a lot of things in there. Now, we are coming to the end of the show, but I do want to ask you very quickly one last question, and for both of you, and please if you could answer quickly. We've heard a lot in the show about Constitution, Constitution clauses 141, 298, etc., etc. But how do you think, Tafazwa, we can strengthen Parliament's oversight role with respect to how the budget is managed and foreign debt is spent? How can we be more proactive in that?
Oh, okay.
I said very quickly, please.
Yeah, yes. So for me, I think that we should just follow the Constitution. We should follow the legal and institutional frameworks that we do have. We already have systems in place which define how Parliament should actually come in as far as the budget is concerned, and how the consultations should be taking place in our country to ensure that even citizens do participate in government decisions regarding allocation and expenditure of our own resources. And so for me, I would say that we simply need political will and sincerity in the part of government to ensure that they practice what they're supposed to do.
Well, just very quickly, your final word on that question.
What we only need is political will, fiscal discipline, and rule of law as far as management of our finances is concerned.
Well, there we go. You have been watching the Mint Special, our discussion, the World Bank's bailout to Zimbabwe, Parliament's oversight role. We'd like to thank our panelists, Tafadzwa Chikumbu, Social Economic Analyst from the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, ZIMCOD, Honourable Willias Madzimure, Parliamentary Committee of Budget, Finance and Economic Development Member and MP for Kambuzuma, and Kobani Shabangu, Head of Programs at Transparency International Zimbabwe. Many thanks for coming on the Mint Special, gentlemen. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN and our partners, the Southern Africa Parliamentary Support Trust, SAPST. Now, if you have any comments or views, we'd love to hear from you. Please contact us via our Facebook page, Zimpaper's TV network, or via our Twitter handle at ZTN News. Now, a final comment. The World Bank support will cover a range of interventions to strengthen health services and primary health care, bolster disease monitoring and reporting, train frontline health workers, encourage community engagement to maintain public trust, and improve access to treatment for the poorest patients. The bank will also provide policy and technical advice to ensure countries can access global expertise. Zimbabwe's Finance and Economic Development Minister, Professor Nkuli Ngube, wrote to multilateral lenders, including the International Monetary Fund, seeking assistance on the 2nd of April 2020. More than half of Zimbabwe's population needs food aid. The economy is strained even before the impact of the global coronavirus pandemic, and the country's health service is facing challenges, and I quote from the minister. With this in mind, transparent reporting on how, when, and to whom any funds raised, either to support the budget or through multinational loans and aid, is spent is critical. More importantly, Parliament must proactively carry out its oversight role with the objective of reporting back to us, the Zimbabwean people. I'm Andy Hodges. Goodbye, and you all be safe.